أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum everyone and welcome back. I'm your host Muhammad, and today we have Shugusta. Assalamu alaikum and jazakallah khair for your participation in this critical discussion. Wa alaikum assalam. One of the questions I want to ask, and how does this model of citizenship compare with the capitalist model? Can capitalism ever really truly guarantee the rights of different communities?
As you have already discussed, how we are, or the world is split up into different countries. The current political world order is built on this nation state model, where we are split up into different nations. And the most dominant system being implemented across the world is the capitalist economic system. It has as its aim for each individual to seek what benefits you the most and to make as much money and material gain as possible. This system, the purpose of life is to live your life to the maximum and fulfill all your needs and wants and desires to the highest level. And as a capitalist, what you deem to be of benefit to you is your criteria for action. So when you put these things together, they result in a situation where at the individual level, at the corporate level, and at the state level, there is an intense level of competition to maximize your own benefits, whether that's the benefit of you personally, your company, or your organization, or your nation, your country. So then, because the economic system is the most dominant system in a capitalist society, the most dominant aim is to make as much money and material gain as possible. And so it's not hard to see that in these societies, it's not possible to accommodate and safeguard different communities from different backgrounds, because instead, an atmosphere of competing with each other has been created. It's about survival of the fittest, or actually survival of the richest. It's about survival of the richest. So people, organizations, and countries are competing with each other over resources. And this is not because there are not enough resources to go around, but the issue is that the focus is not on distribution of these resources to everyone who has a need, but the focus is on acquiring as much of those resources as possible for either yourself, your business, or the country. And instead of bringing communities together and instead of bringing people together in harmony, in cohesion, and in success for all, this intense competition, it actually pits people against each other, and it pits communities against each other, so that the result is that each is looking out for themselves and who they call their own people. We saw just a few weeks ago in the US presidential election debate, Donald Trump, in trying to attract the vote of the Black American, he said about Joe Biden, and I'm going to quote here, he said, "The fact is that his big kill on the Black people is the millions of people that he's allowed to come in through the border. They're taking Black jobs now." And he said that on his debate on CNN. And he went on, he said, they're taking Black jobs and they're taking Hispanic jobs. So quite apart from the fact that we could ask ourselves, what are Black jobs? Or what are Hispanic jobs? He doesn't even realize his own racism. But you can see how comments like this are pitting communities and people against each other. So the Black and Hispanic communities are being told that they need to be wary of anyone new coming into the US. Wary why? Because such people are a threat to your jobs. So they're a threat to your economic success. So not only pitting people against each other, but also reinforcing the basis of that the basis of that is your jobs, your money, your income. So these are the most important things for people. So because wealth and money is the most powerful and influential force in a capitalist society, we see that in these societies, it is the survival of the richest. And so it comes as no surprise then that those who have the most material and most economic power to begin with, they are the ones who reap the most benefits. This is the way, from its aims, capitalism differs to Islam.
So I do have a question for you about something you just said, but before I ask that question, I just wanted to pick up on something you said earlier about how, this whole idea of people coming in from outside and stealing jobs, and if just comparing that to how society was organized, Islamic society was organized, allowed for Muslims and non-Muslims to gain positions of authority, gain positions, of status, and to work together harmoniously. There's a famous interaction that takes place in Islamic Spain between Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, and Muslim scholars. This is something that is well known, that within the Islamic history, that they would learn from one another. And in fact, people would come from all over Europe to come and study in Spain, or come from all over Europe, study in Baghdad, because they, as non-Muslims, they could come benefit from the provisions that the Islamic society had for them. And they weren't seen to be anyone who's coming to take anyone's job. In fact, they were welcome additions to the societies because they brought richness to the society. But what I wanted to pick up on was something you said towards the end, where you said those who have the most material and economic power reap the most benefits. What did you mean by that?
Okay, so those who have the most money to begin with, they have more financial power to make more money. Because in a capitalist economic system, it takes money to make more money. So the system is set up in such a way that it helps and supports and it favors those people who have the most money already, and it helps them make more money. It helps them get more return for their money, for their investments than other people, than compared to people who don't have so much to begin with. And this is at the expense of those who don't have so much to begin with. So it leads to societies with stark disparities and huge inequalities between different groups of people. It doesn't lead to harmonious societies which are taking care of the needs of all their citizens. Those who have the most power and the most influence, the most money, they use that to further their own benefits. And if that means that they need to exploit and tread on others in the process, then so be it. Whatever is necessary to achieve the aims and protect one's own interests. And this is something that's actually really well known. I'm not sharing anything here that should be groundbreaking. This is well documented and it's commented on already. There's a lot of facts and figures and stats that prove this. Every year a summit takes place in Switzerland called the World Economic Forum Summit. And this is a meeting of all the world's biggest billionaires. In January of this year, in 2024, when it took place, Oxfam released a report on the first day of this summit. And they showed in their report that since 2020, the richest 5 men in the world have doubled their fortunes. And during the same period, since 2020, almost 5 billion people globally have become poorer. And the Oxfam International Executive Director, Amitabh Bahar, when he commented on this, he said, this inequality is no accident. He said the billionaire class is ensuring corporations deliver more wealth to them at the expense of everyone else. And he said, runaway corporate and monopoly power is an inequality generating machine. He elaborated, he said, through squeezing workers, dodging tax, privatizing the state, and spurring climate breakdown, corporations are funneling endless wealth to their ultra-rich owners, end quote. So he highlighted some of the ways that the system is set up, like I said, to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. And, as I said before, in capitalism, it takes money to make money. So the major cause a major cause of this inequality is the advantage that people who own inherited wealth, the advantage that they have over people who need to work for a living and are employees, which is the vast majority. So those who own the capital, those who own the money, these rich people take the majority of the business profits. Like you said, they don't pay much tax on their wealth, and they can secure vast amounts of loans using their capital, using their money as security, and then they can reinvest these loans and the cycle continues for them. Whereas on the other hand, the masses, the employees' income, for the majority of us, this is set at a basic survival level. The vast majority of people only really get paid what they need to survive. And actually, many don't even get paid that. There's a cost of living crisis going on where people don't have enough money to survive. And they have to decide between heating and eating. And this is because employees pay high taxes on their income, and they can only obtain loans for personal things like a car or your accommodation. And even then, many people can't even obtain these loans. And so it becomes very, very difficult for the masses to obtain the kind of loans that are needed for big investments. So what this means is that the majority of people can never enter into the world of the rich. They can never set up their own businesses and compete with them. It's the owners of the businesses who actually, driven by benefit as their criteria for action, they're actually always looking for higher and higher returns. And they put their profits first and foremost. And it's definitely, this isn't just a saying, but it is definitely profits before people. And this puts like a downward pressure on their employees and everyone, working for them. And the incomes of those people are squeezed, which is what results in the majority of people barely making enough money to live. And of course, some people can say, no, it doesn't always work like that. There's entrepreneurs, there's self-made millionaires, billionaires. And yeah, sure, you get the exceptions to the rule. You get the breakthrough entrepreneur who climbs that social ladder. And, the original inherited wealth owners, they've actually got a term for people like this. They call them, it's called new money. And it's actually, new money is a term that's used in a derogatory way. But for the vast majority of people, they barely make enough to live on. Often, these are people who are working really, really hard, holding down more than one job, working evenings, working nights, working weekends, both parents in a household working. This is the reality for the majority of people. And so it's no surprise that as a result, through using their money to make more money, we see that the wealthiest 1% in the world own 43% of all global financial assets. And it's no surprise that these are then divided societies, because the resultant poverty for the majority brings all its social disadvantages. Things like inequalities in education, poor nutrition leading to poor health, substandard housing with improper access to, basic utilities like heating, clean water. For some families, it's homelessness. It's inadequate access to healthcare or no access to healthcare. There's higher rates of broken families because of all the pressure that it puts onto households. There's inadequate childcare. There's unsafe neighborhoods. The list goes on and on and on. Capitalist societies are crippling with the problems of this economic disparity that I'm talking about. And there are wide chasms between the haves and the have-nots. And these societies, they're rife with many, many problems, which are affecting the masses who live in these impoverished, often crime-ridden neighborhoods, which have received little or no government funding for many, many years to, regenerate these areas. You only have to drive, in the UK, you only have to drive to some of the northern cities, Liverpool, Sheffield, Newcastle, to see this. And I was quite shocked when I looked up and found that there is an 18.6-year difference in life expectancy between the North and the South. And ever since the 1980s and deindustrialization and a decline in the primary and manufacturing industries in the north of the UK, these parts of the country have actually suffered with huge unemployment and all the consequences that this brings. And this is because successive governments, whether that's the Labour government or the Conservative government, successive governments have failed to take care of the needs of the people living there. And, both these parties have been in power during this time. Both could have done something about it, but no one did. And then you drive to the South and you can compare what you just saw in these northern cities to, the glamour and the glitz of life in the Southeast and in London and everything, all the luxuries that come with that. And that's because this part of the country is home to the corporate giants and government and the ruling elite.
We've talked a bit about how Islamic governance would cater for different communities, would cater for the Jewish people, the Christian people, the Muslim people, the different people from different backgrounds, ethnicities, and so on. How does what you've talked about affect these communities living in capitalist societies?
Okay, so if we look within capitalist nations, we see that nearly always there is some form of racism which is driving the inequality. And we can see this from the comments that Donald Trump made about immigrants coming and taking Black or Hispanic jobs. We can see that it's racism which fuels the competitive drive. And capitalism, because of this, is incapable of bringing different communities together, and instead it prospers from othering different communities to justify their ill treatment. And this is not a new phenomenon for the US because the US has got a long history. If we look at their immigration history, and this is, a series on Palestine. So if we just look at how America turned its back on the Jewish people fleeing Nazi persecution in Europe, we can see that it wasn't due to any lack of information or understanding regarding the persecution of the Jewish people in Europe. It was actually due to an American stance that the number of Jewish people that are going to be allowed to enter the US has to be restricted. And polls were conducted at the time that showed this. And US laws that emerged in the lead up to that era, they were fundamentally discriminatory. So there was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the 1924 National Origins Act that completely prohibited immigration from Asia and set a quota for immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. And this was happening at a time when America was embracing the belief that the United States should be a white Protestant country, and allowing immigrants was going to destroy this nation. And, we saw how these same racist and discriminatory ideas are prevalent in American society today, and they were tapped into by Donald Trump and wrapped up in patriotism and won him a seat at the White House. And might very well so do again at the next polls.
I think the experience of Jewish people under American rule and subject to these racist policies is not something that is unique to United States. When we talked about early on, and we talked about anti-Semitism and how this is being used as a media tool against Muslims, against the pro-Palestinian struggle, protests, and what have you, we actually highlighted that this is actually something which was born out of Europe. It was a European problem. The way in which Jewish people were treated was that started off in anti-Semitism, started off in Europe. So it's not something that's just exclusive to that side of the Atlantic.
That's right. And the UK has continued in the same fashion still. The way in which the UK has treated people who moved here in the 50s from the Caribbean islands, from its own Commonwealth, is one of the biggest proofs of how incapable capitalist society is at taking care of the needs of all of its citizens. There's a 52-page report which is called the Historical Roots of the Windrush Scandal. And this was commissioned by the Home Office into the causes of the Windrush scandal. And this scandal, the Windrush scandal, what it was is effectively it saw thousands of people wrongly classified as illegal immigrants by the Home Office. And I'm not talking about something in Britain's far away past, but these are events that happened in 2017, in 2018. Commonwealth citizens who had been living in the UK for as long as 50 years were threatened with deportation. They were made homeless. They were prevented from working. They were not given government support or benefits. And they were even denied medical treatment by the NHS. These UK citizens, when they reached their pension age, were due to be looked after by the state after having spent like their entire adult life paying taxes to the state, to the British government. They were forced to retire to countries that they hadn't known since their childhood, that they had left in their childhood. And we can compare this to what was discussed earlier about Umar bin al-Khattab and what he said about the dhimmi, where he said, we have not done justice to you if we have taken jizya from you in the prime of your health and neglected you in your old age. So these were people who'd been living and working here, and they'd raised families here in the UK, including Paulette Wilson, who was actually threatened with deportation, even though she'd been in the UK for more than half a century and been working in the House of Commons as a cook, serving food to MPs. And so this report, I'm going to quote to you just from two parts of the report. It says, the British Empire depended on racist ideology in order to function, which in turn produced legislation aimed at keeping racial and ethnic groups apart. End quote. So rather than creating community cohesion and harmony, legislation was produced to keep racial and ethnic groups apart. And the report, it summarized decades of dysfunctional relationships between Britain's institutions and the Black and minority ethnic people. So the report highlighted and brought to people's attention that there was a dysfunctional relationship between the institutions of the state and the citizens that they were supposed to be taking care of. And it concluded that the origins of this deep-rooted racism of the Windrush scandal, and I'm quoting now, lie in the fact that during the period 1950 to 1981, every single piece of immigration or citizenship legislation was designed, at least in part, to reduce the number of people with Black or brown skin who were permitted to live and work in the UK. And it concluded saying, as a result, the experiences of Britain's Black communities, of the Home Office, of the law, and of life in the UK have been fundamentally different from those of white communities. End quote. So if that's not institutionalized racism, I don't know what is. The fact that not everyone has the same opportunities, the law does not treat everyone the same. You know, we'd need a whole separate podcast to discuss police mistreatment and brutality and the death of the Black community in the UK at the hands of the police. And to this day, this is even repeated in France for French Muslims. There is a French political analyst and who's the head of the Committee for Justice and Liberties, Yasser Louati, who has said, if you are a French Muslim applying for a job, you are 5 times more likely to face discrimination than a non-Muslim. If you are a Muslim woman donning a headscarf, you have a 1% chance of finding employment. If you apply for housing, it takes you twice as long to get housing because you are identified either as an African or a North African or a Muslim. And if you are a Muslim youngster in France, police brutality targets you first. And again, as in the US earlier and as in the UK, this is enshrined in law in France. So the anti-separatism law introduced by the French government in 2021, it's been said that it systematically obstructs religious freedom and Islamic practices. And a French jurist, who's also a researcher for the British advocacy group CAGE, has said, for certain, This, the anti-separatism law, deepened an already existing sense of fear and terror in the community. And since the law came into existence, it has led to the closure of mosques and Islamic schools, and religious leaders, imams, have been harassed. Thousands of Muslim businesses have been unfairly investigated by the state. Hundreds have been forcefully closed, and millions of euros have been seized from the Muslim community. So, how can such societies protect the rights of and take care of the needs of all of their citizens?
So I think one of the things that we can really draw a comparison here is you see how differently citizens are treated under capitalist principles and how differently they're treated under Islamic principles. And whereas we talked about how, people from all backgrounds, all walks of life, from all different parts of the world are welcome under the Islamic system, here you've got governments and policies trying to get rid of them. And this is actually something that a lot of far right political parties are using as a basis for their electioneering.
That's right. And this is something that, unfortunately, we're living in a time where it's on the increase, where Europe is moving towards the far right. And as Muslims in the UK, we too have been subject to specific government legislation that has singled us out for different treatment. A lot of our listeners will know about PVE, Preventing Violent Extremism, the program under the Prevent strategy that put the Muslim community in the UK under immense scrutiny and pressure. And there are many examples up and down the whole country of its misuse and how it has been used to question the identity of Muslims in the UK and our beliefs. There are stories in almost every Muslim community of children being referred for holding terrorist-like views if they have supported the cause of the Palestinian people at school. Parents have been called in to explain their child's use of language like Alhamdulillah, praising Allah in the classroom or at school or within earshot of teachers has been considered inappropriate. Teachers have been given training to find out the views of Muslim children in the classroom by setting them certain tasks or projects where they have to present their views on conflicts abroad or present their views on UK foreign policy to try and trip up Muslim students or to try and find out the views of their parents. So definitely the entire UK British Muslim community is well aware of this anti-terror legislation that has been used against Muslim citizens here.
And this just shows a real lack of trust, doesn't it? So if you want community cohesion, how are you going to build community cohesion if you don't trust your citizens? And in fact, what you're doing is not only not trusting them, but you're creating division between communities by enacting such policies.
Yes, and it's led to children self-censoring. The parents actually have said to their children, don't discuss certain things in the classroom, don't talk about certain things with your teachers, don't talk about certain things in front of non-Muslim students at school. There's an incredible amount of distrust.
So rather than people, this societies, communities actually nurturing young citizens, active citizens, confident citizens, they're actually subduing them and silencing them.
Yeah, silencing them. And more than that, people have actually been prosecuted. And this legislation has been used in a really, really discriminatory way. Whereas other members of British society who are not Muslim, they've been treated very leniently for things that should be investigated under this legislation. So, in 2015, the leader of the UK arm of the Jewish Defence League attended a pro-Palestine event and went onto the platform where people were speaking. And, she was armed. This was a woman. She was armed and she assaulted 2 people. She was found guilty. And you think there might be a prison sentence here, but actually she only got community service and a small fine, and anti-terrorist officers, the anti-terrorist branch of the police, were not even involved in the investigation. So the British community, British Muslim community, does feel that it is singled out for this legislation. So if you put all of this together, it's actually no wonder then that 1 in 7 young Black and Asian Britons are making concrete plans to leave the UK. And this is a research survey that was done recently by a consultancy group called Word on the Curb. And they found that 39% of the respondents to this survey said this was due to the cost of living crisis. 28% said it was because of dissatisfaction with the government, and 19% said racial inequality was a factor. So this is 1 in 7 young people who are either Black or Asian making concrete plans to leave the UK.
Yeah, I don't know about anyone else, but I've actually come across many people who actually feel this way. And part of it is because they don't belong. They don't feel like they belong. They're made to feel like they don't belong. And they're made to feel like pariahs or that they're the other. And as a result of that, because they don't feel part of the society, they feel like they need to go find some belonging elsewhere.
Definitely, I agree. I've come across many people, not just amongst the youth, but both older who feel this way. And an interesting part of this article for me was, and this was just a few days ago in The Independent, was the fact that when it was reported, the headline was Exodus. 1 in 7 young Black and Asian Britons plan to quit the UK over government failings and racism. And then under this headline, there was like a subheading and it said exclusive. And I want to read to you what it said here. Here it said, young first and second generation immigrant Britons leaving UK poses significant threat to economy, researchers warn. So I looked at this and I thought, what is going on? The article had actually gone on to report that the Black Pound report published in 2022 had found that Black, Asian, and multi-ethnic consumer parts of the UK hold a 4.5 billion pounds in annual disposable income. And the same article said that they basically have 375 million pounds available to spend monthly. And the reporter stated that Word on the Curb, this research group, is warning that an exodus of young Black and Asian Britons means the economy stands to lose a significant portion of this spending power. So we can see how when capitalism is going to view people, citizens, the youth especially, in terms of their economic worth to the state, which sums up it sums up everything I've said so far, that when you look at people as a commodity, you will not be looking at securing their rights for them. You will not be looking at society from a human perspective, thinking about what's best for humanity. But instead, those in power and authority in society will be looking at people in terms of either their ability to work and generate wealth in the cheapest way possible, or they'll be looking at people in terms of their ability to spend their wealth. So using people to benefit the capitalist elite. And this is why capitalist societies do not lead to community cohesion or harmony, and they don't lead to success and prosperity for all.
The very essence and nature and the belief of this ideology is never going to be able to bring communities together and to create a cohesive society. And before we end, give 1 or 2 take-home points.
I don't think we should shy away from critiquing capitalism and the solutions it is presenting. And I think we need to look at the realities we see around us, and we need to correctly identify that capitalism has failed to bring people together and create fair and just societies. And we need to trace the ills that we see all around us back to their causes. And that is a discussion about ideology. And it requires us to start looking at the system that is creating these realities and think outside of the system for alternative solutions. And this is going to require us to be, to be brave, to be bold, and to be visionary in our thinking. And I invite people to do that. I invite our listeners to be visionary in our thinking.